I'm Tanya Bishop and I'm Parish's Environmental Manager. So I've been doing that for about 12 years now. So next I'll then talk a bit about the legal and planning context that we operate within the National Park, and then touch on our interactions with national parks and some of our broader environmental management issues. So to kick off, welcome to Perisher Valley. Perisher was formed in 1995 and was the bringing together of Perisher Valley, Smeagan Holes, Guthiga, Blue Cow, the Ski Tube Railway, all of which are within Kosciuszko National Park, and then also the station, which is an accommodation facility down in Jindabyne. It's the largest snow resort operation in the Southern Hemisphere, and we were acquired by Vow Resorts in the US in 2015. So we were their first acquisition out of the US. They now have Perisher as well as Hotham Falls in Victoria. Do any of you come up here for a ski or a snowboard? Yeah, about half of you maybe? Oh, Marion's here obviously. Yeah, so hopefully you're pretty familiar with the resort. It might look a little bit different to you now, being here in summer, but it's great to have people visit in all seasons just to get a full picture of what the area is like. So to touch briefly on the social and economic benefits to the region, obviously the surrounding local region relies really heavily on the ski resorts, ourselves, Thredbo, Selwyn, Charlotte's, for tourism and economic and social benefits. I believe it's around 23,000 jobs that the ski industry provides to the Australian economy, and quite unique in that a lot of these are in regional areas, so it's a real attractant and a reason for young people to stay in regional areas, whereas otherwise they're often moving away to the metro areas. In 2019 we had over 2 million skier days in Australia. That's Australia-wide for the ski industry, and data from 2014 shows that we contributed 1.2 billion to New South Wales gross state product. I mean, most of that kind of detail you should be able to find in your own research online, because that's where I found mine. So I don't have too much more meat to add on to those bones, but obviously, I mean, anecdotally, you look at our operation last winter and how critical that was to the local region, especially backing up from the bushfire summer that we had prior to that, where a lot of the tourism industries really suffered. Socially, obviously, skiing, snowboarding, healthy outdoor lifestyle, as well as social and competitive events, and obviously a lot of employment. So moving on, I'll just talk a bit about the planning context that allows us to operate inside a national park. This is obviously Kosciuszko National Park. So there is some state planning law, the State Environmental Planning Policy, Kosciuszko National Park, Alpine Resorts 2007, which is a piece of legislation that allows us to operate within the national park. The objectives of that planning policy are to encourage the carrying out of development as it relates to ski industries in this section of the national park, while minimising environmental, social and economic impacts from that development. It also puts in place planning controls to facilitate the carrying out of that development in this area, recognising that it is development of state and regional significance, and also seeks to minimise the risk of any environmental hazards as a result of that development. So we operate our resort under a lease arrangement from the National Park Service. There's a number of clauses in that lease that relate to things like weed management, environmental research and rehabilitation projects as well. And then there's other legislation that we sit under, no different to anybody else in New South Wales, in relation to Biodiversity Conservation Act, which dictates our impacts to threatened species and offsetting those. Protection of the Environment Operations Act, which talks about all of our pollution, potential pollution to air, water and noise. And also the Environmental Planning and Assessment Act dictates some of our planning and projects and development, conditions of consent, those types of things. As far as our interaction with the National Park Service, as I said, we have a lease with them, so they pretty well act as our landlord. But they do also generate substantial income by having the resorts within that national park footprint. So there's obviously the leasing fees, as well as entry fees for all of our visitors that are coming into the park. So these then contribute to the money available to national parks to carry out a lot of their management projects in relation to cultural heritage, weed, fire, rehabilitation, a whole suite of things. So national parks have a dedicated team of staff to oversee the resort areas, of which Marion is one. So that's the Resort Environmental Services team. It includes Marion, who's the Resort Liaison Officer. There's also a Resort Monitoring Officer and Resort Assessment Coordinator who looks at any of our project proposals. So I work with a number of, well, all of those staff on an ongoing basis. I think we've got quite a collaborative relationship. So we talk about weed monitoring and control. We've done some rehabilitation trials in the past. We're talking about monitoring of some of the fauna features within the resort, like our fauna crossings. We report feral animals to national parks for their management programs. And yeah, we proactively get them out to have a look at any of the projects and proposals that we're suggesting so that we can be on the front foot and work together to minimise our impacts. So generally, in relation to other environmental management within the resort, under our resorts we have a value which is to do good, which is preserving our natural environment and contributing to the success of our local communities. Under that umbrella value, we have an initiative called Epic Promise Commitment to Zero, which incorporates zero waste to landfill by 2030, zero net emissions by 2030, and zero net operating impact on forests and habitat. Obviously, zero waste to landfill by 2030 is going to be a massive hurdle for us for the next decade. And we also have initiatives like Epic Promise Grants, where we work with local youth or environment groups and provide them some funding to carry out their projects. We also have a number of initiatives within the resort that just look to minimise our impacts on threatened species. There's an area in our Blue Cow Resort called Rough Rider that was closed in 2002 that is a known area for the mountain pygmy possum. So we've closed that area to all skier and groomer traffic just to minimise any impacts on the hibernating possums. And we've also had a program of establishing fauna crossings around the resort, which are a bit of a varied mix, but generally a sort of rock-lined corridor that connects areas of habitat across the disturbed ski slope to allow the movement of fauna from habitat areas. So we've probably got about 25 or 30 of those across the resort at the moment. Just one other example of collaboration with national parks is a fairly recent initiative where we've established a local group called Sustainable Snowies. That group came about through a collaboration of national parks, Perisher, Thredbo, Council, and other business and community groups locally who all realised that we had some very similar alignments on environment. So we've formed this local group. So far we've managed to roll out some reusable coffee cup scheme called Green Caffeine to the local area. And we've also recently applied for a grant through the EPA for a litter strategy for the local area. And that's the end of my notes, officially. So if anybody has anything you'd like to discuss more out of all that, or any questions that arose, happy to talk further.
Do you have a hard time engaging the people that come, the tourists, to engage in those kinds of environmental protocols, like the zero waste movement?
It's a bit of a mixed bag. We find we've got people at both ends of the scale. There's people within the resort that are still littering their cigarette butts and have no regard for the environment or the fact that they're within a national park. And then we've got other people who are proactively seeking me out to give me feedback on what we're doing and how we could do it better. So it's still relatively early days for us in those programs. So we're still establishing those engagement programs and how we can get through to the guests. But it's something that we're just going to have to do and continue to work with our marketing departments and others to get those messages out there. Because if we want to get to zero, then it's going to involve getting all our staff and all our visitors on board. There's no way around that. So I would say, yes, it's a challenge, but we're up for it.
I guess I was going to ask maybe if you could offer some more detail about what would be involved in like continuing to develop the park, whether that's ski runs and ski infrastructure or accommodation or anything like that. What are the challenges that you have to deal with in environmental contexts, especially about like the new chair that went in recently over that side? Like what was involved in replacing the T-bars with the chairlift and stuff like that?
Yeah, sure. Yeah. So the new chairlift that was put in over at Guthiga, is that the one you're talking about? The one at Mount Perisher? Leichhardt. Sorry, Leichhardt. So Leichhardt was done under the previous legislation, so the biodiversity offsetting hadn't kicked in at that point, I believe. And that was the same with the Guthiga chairlift. So basically there's a whole lot of planning and options assessment going into any development like that. Obviously from an operational perspective we need to show that there is a need and that we've got the carrying capacity within the resort operation to have that. An example like the Leichhardt chair, actually, despite the fact that it is a large-scale development, we're actually hoping that it will have a net positive environmental outcome because we're moving from a ground lift, which is a T-bar, to an aerial lift, which is a chairlift. So we've got that whole footprint underneath that we can rehabilitate back to native vegetation, which is a huge project and we'll be doing for the next decade and more. So we would just need to look at different designs for the chair, the different alignments we can take, the different, obviously having expert ecologists come in, map the whole footprint, what we need to avoid, not only with the final chairlift, but in the construction footprint. So where do we put our access corridors? Where might we need to use a helicopter, for instance, like we did at Guthiga, to avoid that ground disturbance? Also on Leichhardt, there was a series of works done over snow rather than on ground. So if you've got a couple of metres of snow or a metre of snow and you can get machinery in to remove towers, then that's less impact on the ground surface. So there's all those kinds of thought processes that go into the planning, and then obviously we need to submit those plans for approval. National Parks gets to look at those and provide suggestions, and then we have a bunch of conditions of consent that we need to adhere to for the full construction. It's not a quick process, but consultation is really the key, and starting that consultation as early as possible in the process so that as you're going down the track, nothing sort of crops up as a potential hurdle.
Did you go through this process when you were barring off the pygmy possum habitat?
No, so that was done voluntarily, and it was done 2002, so a long time ago. So that was just an agreement that was made between Perisher and National Parks. It's just a voluntary agreement on our part because it was a known habitat area and it was a proactive thing that we could do.
Would you be prepared to do that for other areas?
I can't commit to anything like that. I'd say that is the key area of habitat, so we've sort of focused on that. But it's not something that I really know has been discussed any further since that time with National Parks. So all of those things are up for discussion, but I couldn't say yes or no to any of that. It'd take a lot more assessment.
You could at least be open.
What's that, sorry?
Could you at least just be open? For
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
So in terms of like rehabilitating areas that you've previously had other infrastructure on, is that something you guys fund yourselves and go towards working towards, or is it more what Parks then does?
If it's anything that relates to a development consent, that's us. So we need to plan for all of that in the early phases, say what we're going to do, and then as a part of the development application or soon afterwards, present a rehabilitation plan that needs to be approved. And that will include all of our planning, as well as all the follow-up monitoring and soil stabilisation. It takes a bit of time because we've got to get plants propagated from nurseries, from local stock. But yeah, that's all work that we do. So yeah, anything that relates to a project or a DA that we've done is on us, and there are also some projects that we're required to do under our lease that are also on us. But obviously National Parks have some different rehabilitation projects that they're undertaking around as well. So the things that you'll see around the village are a little bit us, a little bit them.
Before.
Yeah.
I read my report last year on Perisher and National Parks. I was reading a lot of reports about it, and I was reading one about the Freedom Quarter over in Guthiga, and it mentioned that, if I hope I recall this correctly, that it was like at the base of the chairlift, it was like a bog, and supposedly it was relocated.
Yeah.
How do you go about relocating a bog to somewhere else?
Yeah, so that was a project that we did as a trial in collaboration with National Parks. So there was a T-bar, and we were removing that, and then we were putting the chairlift in. So the alignment of that ground lift was no longer needed, but the footprint of the new chairlift was in an area of bog. The old alignment of the J-bar actually went through an area of bog and had scoured it back down to rock pretty well. So there was bog on both sides, rock in the middle, but down here we were removing some bog. So what we did with the likes of Liz McPhee on site was we had machinery and guys on chainsaws actually excising out sections of the bog, and then they were put on the back of HD carriers, which are a vehicle, and transported directly to the other site and replaced in that site. And then we just sort of backfilled anything with straw just to get the water flow right, put some logs in and some terraces. But that was, like, I would say that's one of our most successful rehabilitation sites because we had the material there, and we recognised that bog is a very valuable material for the environment, so we didn't want to waste it. But we're still actively managing that site sort of 5-10 years later. It's a very slow process.
Rehabilitating, of like, is it getting towards like a more natural state, or is that like, has it had good progress?
A lot of the vegetation, a lot of the vegetative material survived the transplant. So there was already sphagnum and other bog that kicked off straight away, and then we've also gone in and actively planted some carex and other wet area species to sort of help establish it. Yeah, so it's awesome, but it's still a work in progress. Nothing happens quickly up here. Yeah.
What are some of the biggest kind of environmental pressure challenges, I guess, that you face at Perisher?
It depends, I guess, what you're talking in relation to. I mean, like I said, I would say one of our biggest challenges for the next decade is our zero waste to landfill goal.
Yeah.
That's something that we have just proactively taken on as a company, but that is going to take a lot of change in the way that people do their work, a lot of the suppliers that we use, a lot of everything. It's massive. And it also means working closely with National Parks, who run the waste transfer station in the valley. So I'd say that is a massive one. But other issues like your weeds are an ongoing issue year to year, and it seems that every year we operate there's a new weed that pops its head up and becomes a big issue for us. But that has always been the case and isn't going away, so that's just an ongoing one. And then there are a lot of discussions going on at a much higher level around carrying capacity and sort of the broader strategy around development in the park, but that's not really the level that I'm operating at.
What do you see as your longer term exposure to climate change?
We fully acknowledge the realities of climate change, and we know that there will be change, although we don't quite know what that's going to look like. So we're preparing ourselves for change, but on what scale, we're not sure. We've sort of got two different strategies. One is adaptation and the other is mitigation. So under our EPIC promise, we have a zero net emissions by 2030. So we'll be looking to improve our energy efficiency as well as move to renewables or offsetting for anything that's left over by 2030, hopefully before that time. And then other strategies like expanding snowmaking will hopefully prepare us for the changing precipitation and temperatures, and hopefully give us a bit of a upper hand to be, to not be impacted as badly as we could be otherwise.
And you said off camera when we were talking that there's no strategy on Vale's part to move to summer recreation forms of opening up the mountain bike and that sort of activity?
Look, again, I wouldn't definitively say no, but currently we don't have summer recreation in the valley, and we don't have mountain biking or some of the other facilities that are operating out of your other resorts. Yeah, obviously that's it's a very big part of the business in other areas, so in Victoria and over in America, but currently it's not the situation for Perisher.
So for the camera, Threadbow, which is not Vale, summer bike riding is a pretty big activity for them up there. Slightly different setup because you don't own the chalets around here. You
Yeah, that's right.
So
That's right.
Threadbow owns the entire village, and there's different sorts of things that work and don't work there.
Yeah.
Whereas here at Perisher, the cabins you see around and about are individually leased to national parks. It's a
Yeah,
different setup.
yeah. That's right.
All right, you guys are worried about the snow gum dieback that's going to happen?
Yeah, 100%. We're very worried about it.
Yeah.
So yeah, we've been talking with Matthew Brookhouse and his team.
Team Brookhouse.
Team Brookhouse? You're up here? Yeah. Awesome. I stopped and chatted with your colleagues earlier. They were having lunch on the grass. Yeah. Yeah, we're really worried from an ecological perspective, 100%, but also it impacts us operationally. I mean, the trees are a really important feature for snow retention, shade, they delineate runs. So yeah, from an operational perspective, yes, but it's just to have something happen so rapidly and to be able to watch it happening is frightening, and to not know what to do about it or to have nothing that you can actively do to help in that situation yet is a bit scary.
I did see you guys like doing some plantings though, like along one of the roads. I saw some
Yeah.
snow gums being planted. So.
Yeah. So we've got a project with National Parks where this summer we're just putting in 500 eucalypts. Just in that area you might have seen in Centre Valley, we've put a fair bit in there. We're putting some in at Guthiga. There's a few sites around the resort that I guess we didn't know what the impact of that may be, but it was something that we could do short term, and it won't have a negative impact. It can't hurt. Yeah, so we thought we would just take a step in the right direction, hopefully, of establishing the next generation of snow gums. And 500 is a drop in the ocean, but hopefully we can build on that year on year and then find out some research findings from you guys, and then what else we can do proactively to help it along, hopefully.
It's a scary thing.
Yeah, it is. It really is.
I'll invite people to start cooking up last questions because at least one unit wants to get to Melbourne by the end of today, and the rest of us, I think, need to. No, it's too late back into Canberra. So if you think of the last question, I'll just ask: snowmaking.
Yes.
What are the climate limitations on when you can make snow, and are there environmental impacts, positive or negative, from snowmaking?
Yes, so I don't have the detail on when snowmaking is effective. I could get it to you as far as bulb temperatures, humidity and all those sorts of things. So I don't know those off the top of my head, but obviously there are limitations to the climate or the weather that you can work within to make snow. A lot of our newer snowmaking has really localised weather stations so that they're an automated operation. So from an energy perspective, they're much more efficient than having somebody go out on the hill and turn things on and off, depending on conditions. They have potential benefits for the likes of your mountain pygmy possum in retaining snow cover, where that might be diminishing due to climate change or other factors. We could potentially use it as a bushfire management tool within the resort. Like we've got a sprinkler system across the whole resort, which could be of benefit to protecting infrastructure as well as critical environment. But obviously it's a big user of energy as well. So that will be addressed under our zero net emissions by 2030. That'll all eventually go to renewables. But as the technology improves, the system is becoming more efficient as well.
But it still requires overnight temperatures that are low?
Yes.
Yes.
Yes, it does. So there are other systems coming online now, like your snow factory, which we're not utilising here, which are basically a big refrigerator that just churn out snow, so it doesn't matter what your temperature is on the outside of the box, it all happens on the inside. So that might be okay on a very small scale, but these sorts of systems do rely on the cold temperatures and the right humidity, so they're not foolproof.
Students back at home, you basically extract the water from a river system and it's just assumed that that water will melt back into the same river system. There's no net extraction.
Yes, that's right. There'll obviously be some water lost to evaporation, but it is generally perceived as a storage of water from the catchment that will be returned back to the catchment on snow melt.
And is there an additive into the snow to help with the freezing process? Okay. There you go. It's time for you that you had to think of that question.
I'm also happy to take email questions, or if anything comes to you on the bus, as it always does. You can shoot me an email through Robert.
I know there's like Perisher's advertising talking about how you use like snowy hydro for your energy source, but you said like you want to be like net zero by 2030. How much of your electricity usage at least is currently like renewable powered?
Yeah, we're not currently using renewables. Possibly.
What's the red?
So Red Energy is an electricity retailer for Snowy Hydro, so it's their retail arm. So they sell energy from the grid. Yeah.
Is that not renewable then? Like, isn't it hydro?
If they're just drawing from the grid, then it's whatever you pay for. Yeah.
They definitely advertise as being, selling.
So Red Energy is an Australian-owned local retailer arm of Snowy Hydro. Yeah. So we have some solar panels at the moment down on Brooks Flat, which
Yeah.
is generating some renewable electricity for that side. Yeah.
Are solar panels like are they a challenge in winter? Like, is that something that, or do they melt? Like,
They can get some snow and ice on them,
Yeah.
but there's other buildings around here that use them without too many issues. So ours are obviously down at Bullocks Flat, so there's not quite the snow cover that you would get up here.
yeah.
I also think that's a problem that a lot of other places in the world are dealing with. And
Yeah,
probably figured out ways
but
to deal with snow and
There's
solar.
plenty of examples of solar panel being used in Alpine Resorts.
I guess it's like a lot of the roofs are quite steep around here too, though, because like they're made for snow. Like I think. solar
Yeah, they
panels-
would shed.
Yeah, but I think
snow
for solar
pretty
panels
well.
would be like efficient, they have to be like kind of at a certain angle to the sun or something. I think.
But they're actually building, like in Japan, they're now building flat-roofed buildings because it's better to go and purposefully clear it than have the snow fall off. And as it's like a danger from the snow falling off the roofs. So I think it would just be a similar thing that you'd just pay someone to clear it. Or have to devise a way that they self-clear the snow.
Outside, yeah. When I got here, I was just like, there's so many roofs.
Yeah.
You know?
There are, yeah.
I don't think the efficacy of solar panels is one of the students' field trip report
Oh, good.
assessment
I can't
points.
inform that.
Unless there's a pressing last question, I think I'd like you to thank Tanya. And be aware of Matt Brookhouse's works with Parisher and other opportunities for honours projects.
Yeah, and we get
research
volunteers and stuff all the
projects
time.
on the rubbish management project that we had talked about doing,
Yes, yes.
So various opportunities, project opportunities, some of which get you to stay up in the high country for little bits of the time in winter and sometimes in summer. Please also can we thank Marion for having a wonderful day. Projects of Marion involve counting and exterminating weeds and going around in helicopters or something and various things, hawk, weed, various things.